So let me introduce what a cache is. So typically in a computer, you have a processor, then you have a main memory, which is also called the RAM, and then you have the hard disk. So there are a few terminologies here. The latency means it is the time taken to access the memory. It could be the latency to the RAM, which is typically, let's say, around 1 nanosecond, or latency to access. Sorry, this is about 100 nanoseconds. This is DRAM. This is I'll come to SRAM later. And then the time to access the hard disk, which is thousands of nanoseconds. So that is called latency. Then the bandwidth is how many accesses you do per unit time. And then capacity is basically memory size. So basically, the RAM that you have is DRAM, and that takes a lot of time to access. Whereas any other memory which is much more closer to the processor will take lesser time to access, and we will discuss about what that kind of a memory is. So basically, if you look at this graph, the processor speed has gone up over the years and the memory speed has not quite caught up with the processor. So there's a huge gap between the processor speed and the memory speed. So therefore, there is a need for a better memory. So what should that better memory look like? It should be uh, it should have a good capacity, or it should be large in size. It should be faster, and also it should be less expensive. But this is counterintuitive because large memories will be slow. Because if you have a large memory array, then you will have to have a decoder to access the rows and columns, which is going to take up a lot of time. Therefore, they will be slow. And if you make them faster, they will be expensive. Therefore, there has to be a balance somewhere. So the idea is this is the idea. You do not want to go to the main memory often, which means you want to go there very rarely. So if this is the processor, you want to go to the main memory very rarely. And we also see that we can have most frequently used data or most often used data can be placed right there along with the processor on the same die. Okay, you can place a small memory here on the processor die, which is going to contain the most frequently used data. And that memory, which is sitting there on the processor die, containing the most frequently used data, is called the cache. So how do you decide what data to put in the cache? So we said we'll have a cache or a memory, which is going to sit there right on the processor die, which is going to have the frequently used data. So what is the advantage of having a cache which has frequently used data is you can access it right here. And because it is closer to the die, it is right there on the die, it is going to be faster. And you don't have to go outside of the processor. And therefore, the, uh, the access to this particular memory is going to be much, much faster. So what is that frequently used data that you will keep in the cache? So if you observe, for example, let us observe a loop. So what do you have in a loop? In a loop, you will normally have data which are referenced to again and again. So for example, you might be using some number, some loop like this, or a of I plus a of 10, something like this. So both of them are memory accesses, but you're constantly using this a of 10. So let us say that a of 10 is 3. So you're constantly, repeatedly using that 3 over and over again. That means with over a period of time. So if over a period of time, over an interval of time, you are constantly referencing this data. So that kind of repeated referencing to a certain data in a certain interval of time over and over again, it's called temporal locality. So locality means you are referencing it again and again, you are using it again and again, and you are using it over a period of time, and that is called temporal locality. So basically what you can do is instead of saving, going to the external memory to get this 3, you can put it in the cache. So you have this cache here, you can store the data 3 in the cache so that the processor does not have to go to this slower memory outside. And this memory which is sitting there, that the cache, that has to be faster. Usually it is made of SRAMs. It's faster and it is right there on the processor die. Therefore, the access speeds are much, much better. Let's say a couple of nanoseconds and so on. So that is what you do in a cache. So one of the properties you make use is the property of temporal locality. There is also another property. So let us look at this program, another, let's say a statement, a of I plus a of I plus 1. So what you are doing here is you are referencing nearby location. So if you referenced location 0, you are referencing location 1, and in the next time you iterate, you're going to refer to a of 2, a of 3, and so on. So here you are referencing data which is nearby in space. And that is why this kind of feature or a property is called spatial locality, which means you are referencing addresses which are and data which are nearby and closer to each other. So these two properties, the temporal locality and the spatial locality, are basically used while you store the data in the cache. So this is an example I already mentioned. So you have an array, and then you are referencing nearby locations, so b of 0, b of 1, and so on. So this is one of the examples of spatial locality. So that is what a cache is. It's also written sometimes as dollar to represent cache because that's how it's pronounced. So cache is nothing but a small, fast, on-chip memory. It is right there on the processor. I'm showing this processor block separately because this you can consider it as the processing block, which has our ALU decoders and so on. So this is our processing block, and that is interfacing to the cache on the same die. And then there is the external memory. So you can also think of this as a library analogy. So there are a lot of books in the library, but the most frequently used books, you want to keep it on your desk because you do not want to go back to the shelf again and again to fetch the books. So that is how you can think about cache. So the next question is, how do you transfer data from the memory to the cache, and what is that data? How much of data do you transfer? So because we know this is a byte addressable memory, and we also know that currently we're talking of MIPS and it has 32 bits of data. So do you transfer 8 bits? Do you transfer 32 bits? So that's something we have to decide. So whatever is the minimum unit of information that you transfer from the memory to the cache, that is called as a block. It's also called a line. Okay, the minimum unit of information transferred, it's called a block or a line. So it is up to you, up to the designer, cache designer, what should the cache block size be. So do you have just one cache or do you have multiple caches? So typically how it is done is the cache which is closest to the processor. So this is the processor which has registers. So registers also store data. That is why they are the fastest and they are part of the processor. Therefore, their access time is quite low. It is quite fast. So that is the closest to the processor. The next one, which is closest, is the cache. So all of this is the cache on the die. Now there can be multiple levels of caches. It's called level 1, 2, 3. Level 1 is closest to the processor and it is also the smallest. So you can see typical sizes are 32 KB, 16 kilobytes, 64 kilobytes, and so on. So it is the closest to the processor, it's also the smallest, and it is also the fastest. So it is small, and therefore it is fast, and it's also the closest to the processor. Now, not all data can fit in the cache. So your external memory is these days 8 gig, 12 gig, even higher. So it's not good enough if you just have a 32 kilobytes of cache. So what you do is you add another level of cache, which is called level 2 cache. So basically, when you look for data, you first look for it in L1 cache. You don't find it there, you go to L2 cache. If you don't find it there, you go to L3 cache. And you don't find it there, you go to the main memory. You don't find it there, you go to the hard drive. So that's how it works. So level 2 cache obviously will be slightly more slower because it is farther away from the processor, and it's also bigger in size. It has to be, because otherwise there's no point having another level of cache. And because it is slightly farther away and larger, it is going to be slightly more slower. And similarly, level 3, it's going to be even larger and even slower. But still, it is much faster as you compare it with the external memory, which is of course huge in size and also external, therefore it is slow. So this is what is called as a memory hierarchy. So you have a hierarchy of caches, and then you have the external memory, hard drive, flash drive, and so on. So how do you access data? So there are different structures of caches. I'll come to it in a minute. Now, how do you access data? In very simple terms, you have a load instruction. Let us first talk about load. Load is basically reading data from the memory. So if you did not have a cache, what you would do is you would issue load to the memory, and the memory would send you data. Now also you do the same thing, but instead of sending the load to the memory, what you would do is you would send it to the cache. So this is our cache. So what would you do? You would send the load along with the address of the memory what you want to read. So let's say I want to read M of 0x4003. So this is the memory address. So I will send that to the cache. And in the cache, I'm going to look for the data present in this M of 4003. And if I find the data, I will return it back to the processor, and my job is done. So if I find the data in the cache, it is called a cache hit. Data is present in the cache, I return it. If I don't find the data in the cache, let's say I send another address, M of 0x4005. That is not present in the cache. The data is not present in the cache. Therefore, it's called a cache miss. So if I don't find the data in the cache, what I will do is I will send that same address to the memory. Ideally, you should find that in the memory. From the memory, you will send the data back to the processor. And you might also update the cache. Okay, so we'll update the cache because you expect that it will be used again. So that is the whole idea of the cache. If I have used a of 0, I am assuming that I might use a of 0 again. Therefore, I will store it in the cache. If I use m of 4005 and it was a cache miss, that means it was initially not in the cache, I fetch it from the memory, and just in case I put it in the cache, assuming that I might need M of 4005 again due to either spatial locality or temporal locality. Okay, so because of one of these, I might need it again, therefore I'll put it in the cache and I will return that data to the processor. So there are going to be lots of terminologies in caches. So remember, a block was the minimum unit of data that is transferred, and there are multiple levels of caches. If you find the data in the cache, it's a hit. If you don't find it, it's a miss. So overall, what is our objective in using caches? The objective is we want to improve the performance of the processor and the system. You want to reduce the hit time, that is the time taken to access data from the cache. So that is the hit time. So if it is one clock cycle, that should be the minimum. If it is taking about 5 cycles, you want to try and reduce it further. So you want to reduce the hit time. You want to reduce the miss rate. So what is the miss rate? If I send some address to the cache, I want to find the data in the cache most often. So I do not want to have a cache miss. So I do not want to have a cache miss and go to the memory. Why? Because it is going to be slower. If I go to the external memory, the access will be slower, and therefore I want to try and reduce it. So you can never have 100% cache hit rate. Okay, so we try and achieve 80 to 90% hit rate in the cache, and that is good enough. And if I miss in the cache, what will happen? I'll have to go to the external memory and fetch the data. So I'm going to be wasting some amount of time here in accessing the external memory. And that is called miss penalty. So it could be 200 clock cycles. It could be 50 clock cycles. It depends on the memory. It depends on that interface between the processor and memory and so on. Therefore, I want to reduce first the hit time. I want to reduce the miss rate, and therefore I want to reduce the miss penalty. So those are the objectives of a cache design.